I'm Kathleen Olive. Welcome to Limelight Arts Travel's Art Podcast, A Closer Look. Peggy Guggenheim is well known as a collector of great international modern art. But what's less known is how she personally championed developing Italian art movements. The Futurist painter Gino Severini was one of her favourite artists. Peggy even had his abstract painting C = Dancer hanging in her living room in her Venetian palazzo. In this episode, Limelight's Dr. Nick Gordon speaks with Freya Middleton, a specialist art guide who interned at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice, about why this painting is so important to her and why it's one she'd steal for her own home.
Well, welcome back, Freya, and thank you for bringing in this other work for us to talk about. So we're used to hearing you talk more about great masterpieces of Renaissance and medieval art, Baroque art, but we also know too that kind of, especially after having had a fellowship in the Guggenheim, that you kind of completely fine with talking about more modern works of art too. So what we'll be looking at here is a much more, I suppose, a very influential Italian movement from the early 20th century. But as a way to start talking more about what's going on in this work, Freya, could you perhaps start by describing it to us?
Yes, absolutely, with the utmost pleasure, considering this is one of my favourite paintings. You've got your kind of little thoughts in your mind, don't you? Who would do my portrait if I could get any painter, who would in any century, and what are the paintings that I might, just take one day and end up on my wall? And I have to say to everyone that Gino Severini's C = Dancer, this painting that he did in early 1914 is absolutely one of them. And Peggy did her, Peggy was extremely intelligent and absolutely right to buy this painting. So, and I love to think of it, when you do visit the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, how it was in her lounge room, and so she would have, sat down and had a bowl of pasta looking at this fabulously positive painting full of movement and light. So what are you looking at? The name is C = Dancer. And that's exactly what you're looking at. Can you imagine that Gino Severini was quite ill. He had a weak constitution and he was ill throughout his rather long life, though. He died in his early 80s, but he had a weak constitution. And in fact, he spent a whole year convalescing in the coastal town of Anzio, which is, about 80 kilometers from Rome. And can you imagine, getting some winter sun and sitting on his chair at a cafe on the coast. And he absolutely loved dance. He was a great dancer himself. And I'll explain a bit about that later. Imagine that a woman is there in front of him dancing. Maybe imagine in your minds, maybe busking or something. But you've got the waves rolling in directly behind her. And Gino Severini had this concept of reality, that everything was fluid, that there were no kind of solid forms. And there he is looking at this woman, but he can also see the waves crashing behind her. And that's what you're looking at. So imagine that this painting, bring it to life, give it movement. And can you see that when you see the blue cylindrical fragments, that is a wave crashing, the crest of a wave. So imagine that. And here, when you're looking at this, imagine the sound of that, of that wave crashing. And then imagine a woman pirouetting in movement, constant movement. So of course, you're not going to see something with sharp contours. Of course, it's fragmented and broken up, just like when somebody runs past you. You can see the arms moving, you can see the legs moving. That's what's happening here. Can you see now? Look at her legs. So look at the bottom half of the painting, and can you see these circular cylindrical forms that's created with these beautiful yellows and oranges, and you can see the gyrating movement of her legs, and it's almost that the torso is on a diagonal. So look in the center part of the painting, and you can see maybe that green cylindrical block. And imagine that there she is, as she's kind of got her arms outstretched, maybe flailing around. They kind of pick up the sides of the crest waves going. And here you can see that. So you've got the woman that's closest to you, and then you've got the waves coming by. And now you can see that of course, it's not something you're ever supposed to see with 100% clarity. because movement isn't like that. And that's exactly what he's doing right now on this flat two-dimensional surface. He's opening up and giving you numerous different angles of this woman and the waves in the background. And that's why this painting is called C equals dancer. It's not all C, it's not half C, it's not all dancer, it's not half dancer. It's the fluidity of life that's in constant movement. And can you see it's the original frame? And they go beyond the frame, because in a moment, this will, of course, it's the spontaneity of this art of Gino Severini and of the Futurists as they're trying to capture dynamism and vivacity of the modern world. And here it is, she's about to pirouette out of the very frame itself.
And that's kind of a beautiful analysis of it and kind of how it's working. And I think it really helps us see that movement and that kind of interaction of the movement of the waves and the dance to that constant fluidity, even with those two sets of colors beginning to blur into each other up in the top right, where you start seeing the blue and the red becoming purple as those movements intersect with one another. So yeah, the more you can see in it like that.
Absolutely. And, he wrote, it was exactly this period that he has his first rather successful show in the Marlborough Gallery in London, where he shows this exact type of work. And they were sold. It was very successful. And indeed, that's why you actually, to an international audience, is why Gino Severini's paintings are really, all over the world. And he wrote a manifesto along with this exhibition, and he talks of this particular interest he's got and this style that he's amalgamating two different forms he coined as plastic analogies, precisely because he viewed life as this fluidity where humans themselves don't exist in this finite form, but blend with their circumstances around them. And so here he is. He often takes these two elements and in some shape or form or some way they kind of blend together and go apart, then leave one another and then come back together, which is exactly why when you said in the top right hand corner you kind of can't really make out anymore what you're looking at because they've come to one. But then you look to the center of the painting and you can see maybe more of the woman, and then you look to the right hand side of the painting and you can feel the kind of crashing of the wave. So he actually coined this blade in this period of his life from about 1910 to about 1916. He has these works that combine these different elements that become one, but then also remain at the same time themselves. Plastic analogies, he called them. Because indeed, as you mentioned, Gino Severini is one of the leading exponents of this early 20th century Italian movement called Futurism. He was one of the artists that signed the Futurist Manifesto in 1910 with the poet, writer, founder of the movement, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. And he, along with three other artists, signed this movement. And it was this idea of embracing the modern world, embracing technology, embracing movement, embracing everything to do with the modern world, the airplane, the car, velocity, dynamism, and to turn their back entirely from anything, obviously growing up in Italy, the Renaissance and the classical world, and, get rid of it. A lot of the other works it was this desire to show movement and dynamism and light and change in work, contrary to a lot of the other artists in the Futurist movement, which they embraced a certain sense of violence in order to be able to change the world and to not have any skerricks of the old world. You needed to be strong and almost violent in your, burn museums, burn old art. It can't influence anything. But Gino Severini adores, has a certain sense of positivity in his work, and he loves dance, like we were saying. And in fact, about 4/5 of the body of his work, in kind of his first 20 years of the 1900s, is all about dance, which of course has this wonderful sense of uplifting movement and positivity to it.
And on that too, kind of that positivity seems to maybe also reflect some of his other awareness of movements outside of Italy, like from his time in Paris, where no doubt he saw plenty of dances as well in early 20th century Paris.
Love to see You're absolutely. He was the bridge, wasn't he, between, for the Italian Futurists. He was the one who went to Paris at a very young age in his early 20s. And indeed, the Futurist Manifesto was published in the Figaro, the Italian magazine, because they thought that their reach would be wider. And so I love the idea that the Italian Futurists, such as, Carlo Carrà and Umberto Boccioni, would kind of couch surf on at his home in Paris, and he lived in the area around Montmartre, where, of course, all these other artists such as Picasso and Braque and Amedeo Modigliani and the writer Apollinaire. I mean, this was the atmosphere and the environment with which he, was kind of brushing shoulders and, soaking up. And he, of course, therefore, then was that bridge that then enabled those Italian futurists to come up and also then be involved in this early 1900s modern painting and modern mentality. And when he did arrive in his early 20s, after being in Rome for a few years, where he had gone, indeed, I mean, he came from a humble family in Cortona, and then he went to Rome and started studying art, and then was introduced to the work of Giacomo Balla, who was an Italian divisionist painter, meaning that this was a type of art that had developed in the neo-impressionist period of the 1880s in France under Georges Seurat. And it was this idea of this breaking up of colour, wasn't it, where there's no blending of colour, but indeed dots of pure colour, and studying the science of optical tonal qualities, so as to get this kind of almost like a science of color in order to bring out as much light as possible in the painting. And so Giacomo Balla, when he was introduced to Giacomo Balla, the Italian divisionist painter in Rome, who he was deeply influenced by, as you can clearly see from this painting. And also he met his great friend Umberto Boccioni, who'll be one of the leading futurist painters and great sculptor in this period as well. But then he goes off by himself, poor, without, maybe kind of, $10 in his pocket, and ends up in Paris, the most modern of all the cities at the time, and this unbelievably electric, artistic, modern environment. And there he is to study, really, Georges Seurat's painting, as well as everything else, and to make a bob, to make some money. He was a great dancer, and he would frequent the cabaret life in the evenings of the City of Lights, wasn't it? Because the city with gas lighting, and where the night comes alive and it's dynamic and full of life, with these cabaret clubs like Folies Bergère and Moulin Rouge. And he's paid to, he earns some money in dancing with the clients, with this wonderful, and so I love to imagine him, weak constitution, but this fast-paced man dancing with these men. So when we talk about him doing dances, for example, imagine the modern dancing. Imagine this kind of fast-paced dance of the Moulin Rouge, more so than the ballerinas that Degas would be doing, for example.
Good. And that kind of, I think, makes also more sense of the positivity, the lightness, the brightness, that there's that sense of optimism in a world that's going forward. You mentioned that this work was created in early 1914, and the effect of World War I is you kind of start seeing a lot of artists after World War I moving away from more decadent sort of works from the pre-war period, a kind of the return of, say, more somber colours and more classical treatment of form in the period after World War I. Does Severini undergo a similar transformation, or does he continue moving with this kind of personal optimism?
Absolutely. What I mean, it is whilst they had supported and more than supported, they had encouraged and advocated for war. War will cleanse, the world of the heavy weight of classicism and of tradition and the bounds of society. Unfortunately, indeed, we see that Russolo, one of the leading futurist painters, is gravely injured in the First World War. His great friend, Severini's great friend, Boccioni, is killed in the First World War, and Severini himself couldn't actually take place in service because of his weak constitution. So he himself didn't, but he was deeply disturbed and affected by the death of his friends and indeed the destruction of the war. And his work, he returns to figurative painting. In about 1916, with the death of his friends, he actually then leaves this futurist, divisionist, optimistic painting and returns to a more classical, figurative, contoured painting. Indeed, that continues throughout his 1920s with this. It says he says it's the return to order, is what, and he not only does that, he also embraces religion once again. In this period when he is painting The Sea Equals Dancer, he's absolutely a self-professed atheist. He'd grown up in a Catholic household. Then he leaves religion, and in fact, it is exactly just a few months before this painting is painted, he marries his great love, Jeanne, the daughter of a French poet, and they have a civil ceremony. But then after in exactly the same year, in fact, he loses his great friend Boccioni. Their son dies, and this was also, he believes in his autobiography, he wrote that he believed it was because of his situation, his poor situation, that killed his son. And so it was something that indeed he bared the cross of for his entire life. And so this optimism that you see captured here, for eternity, which goes against this idea of the spontaneity and the fleeting moments of fluidity of life, is indeed really captured in this period of the 1913, 1914, before those great tragedies in his life. You're absolutely right. So this is something in this period. And then indeed in the 1920s, like we said, this return to order of this figurative painting. And then what he will develop, because he'll die in the 1960s, he will make some fabulous religious frescoes and religious mosaic. He became an incredibly talented and prolific mosaic artist, and will work. Whilst Paris, he said he was greatly attached to two places in his life: Cortona, where he was born but left when he was 16 years old, Cortona gave him life. Paris gave him his intellectual and artistic life. So they're two places, and indeed he's buried actually in Cortona. But he'll become in the 20s and the 30s, he'll live and work in Switzerland, and be connected to a particular group called the St. Luke group, which was this that largely was connected to religious artwork.
Wow, that's such a fascinating change. But as you're talking about his work as a mosaicist, you can see just even in this work as well that use of dabs of color and kind of using small dabs that are kind of alternating colors, slightly different tones, and that kind of this work, part of the luminosity to me, or the might be coming from that mosaic-like quality of divisionism, but finding it.
Point. What an absolutely great point. These kind of individual tesserae that are we are pure color, of pure glass or enamel, that absolutely resonate light in itself and catch light. It's a great point that you can absolutely see already, 15 years earlier, 20 years earlier.
Well, it's an astounding work to keep looking at, just while we've been speaking as well, just noticing just how dynamic it is. But that, as you pointed out, that it has all of this energy and dynamism, but without a sense of violence that we sometimes find in some of the other futurists, that there's something more about the movement of the spheres perhaps kind of going on in this. There's a pretty difficult to pin down harmony going on, but I think kind of the things you've talked about around the work, but also the way you've described what's going on inside the work, has really brought a lot of it to life and made a lot more sense of what's going on inside this and why it's so significant. Maybe just as a final question, so when you steal this from the Guggenheim, whereabouts is it hanging in your house?
Oh, just like Peggy, in my lounge room. I'm going to have my morning coffee with it. Absolutely. This, if nothing will get me up out of this is absolutely the work that will get me up out of my chair with my morning coffee and give me that absolute sense of, of life to carry through the day. This is my St. Christopher, isn't it? They put that St. Christopher on just above the door, the last thing you see to protect you for the day. This absolutely will give me the energy, along with my morning coffee for the day.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.